Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
This episode is brought to you by Prime. Obsession is in session, and this summer, Prime Originals have everything you want. Steamy romances, irresistible love stories, and the book-to-screen favorites you've already read twice. Off Campus, Elle, Every Year After, The Love Hypothesis, Sterling Point, and more. Slow burns, second chances, chemistry you can feel through the screen. Your next obsession is waiting. Watch only on Prime.
Tonight's reading comes from The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby, written by Charles Dickens and published in 1838. This story follows a young man's journey through hardships and injustice in Victorian England. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, you may not know that it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with the support from subscribers and patrons on Patreon, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This also creates for an ad-free experience and helps support episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, and I completely understand that it is not an option for everybody, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would ever like to say hello to me, you can always do that by visiting boytosleep.com. And if you know someone who would benefit from a good night's rest, you're always welcome to recommend the podcast to them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Author's Preface. This story was begun within a few months after the publication of the completed Pickwick Papers. There were, then, a good many cheap Yorkshire schools in existence. There are very few now. Of the monstrous neglect of education in England, and the disregard of it by the state as a means of forming good or bad citizens, and miserable or happy men, private schools long afforded a notable example. Although any man who had proved his unfitness for any other occupation in life was free, without examination or qualification, to open a school anywhere, although preparation for the functions he undertook was required in the surgeon who assisted to bring a boy into the world, or might one day assist, perhaps, to send him out of it, in the chemist, the attorney, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the whole round of crafts and trades, the schoolmaster excepted. And although schoolmasters, as a race, were the blockheads and impostors who might naturally be expected to spring from such a state of things, and to flourish in it, these Yorkshire schoolmasters were the lowest and most rotten round in the whole ladder. Traders in the avarice, indifference or imbecility of parents, and the helplessness of children, ignorant, sordid, brutal men, to whom few considerate persons would have entrusted the board and lodging of a horse or a dog. They formed the worthy cornerstone of a structure, which for absurdity and a magnificent, high-minded laissez-aller neglect has rarely been executed in this world. We hear sometimes of an action for the damages against the unqualified medical practitioner who has deformed a broken limb in pretending to heal it. But what of the hundreds of thousands of minds that have been deformed forever by the incapable pettifoggers who have pretended to form them? I make mention of the race as of the Yorkshire schoolmasters in the past tense. Though it has not yet finally disappeared, it is dwindling daily. A long day's work remains to be done about us in the way of education, heaven knows, but great improvements and facilities towards the attainment of a good one have been furnished of late years. I cannot call to mind now how I came to hear about Yorkshire schools when I was not very robust child, sitting in by-places near Rochester Castle, with a head full of partridge, strap, tom pipes, and Sancho Panza. I was always curious about Yorkshire schools, fell, long afterwards, and at sundry times, into the way of hearing more about them. At last, having an audience, resolved to write about them. With that intent, I went down into Yorkshire before I began this book, in very severe winter time, which is pretty faithfully described herein, as I wanted to see a schoolmaster or two, and was forewarned that those gentlemen might, in their modesty, be shy of receiving a visit from the author of the Pickwick Papers. I consulted with a professional friend who had a Yorkshire connection, and with whom I concerted a pious fraud. He gave me some letters of introduction in the name, I think, of my travelling companion. They bore reference to a supposititious little boy who had been left with a widowed mother who didn't know what to do with him. The poor lady had thought, as a means of thawing the tardy compassion of her relations in his behalf, of sending him to a Yorkshire school. I was the poor lady's friend, travelling that way, and if the recipient of the letter could inform me of a school in his neighbourhood, the writer would be very much obliged. I went to several places in that part of the country, where I understood the schools to be most plentifully sprinkled, and had occasion to deliver a letter until I came to a certain town, which shall be nameless. The person to whom it was addressed was not at home, but he came down at night, through the snow, to the inn where I was staying. It was after dinner, and he needed little persuasion to sit down by the fire in a warm corner, and take his share of the wine that was on the table. I am afraid he is dead now. I recollect he was jovial, ruddy, broad-faced man, that we got acquainted directly, and that we talked on all kinds of subjects, except the school, which he showed a great anxiety to avoid. Was there any large school near? I asked him in reference to the letter. Oh yes, he said, there was a pretty big Was it a good one? I asked. He said. It was as good as another, and was a matter of opinion, and fell to looking at the fire, staring round the room, and whistling a little. On my reverting to some other topic that we had been discussing, he recovered immediately, but, though I tried him again and again, I never approached the question of the school, even if he were in the middle of a laugh, without observing that his countenance fell, and that he became uncomfortable. At last, when he had passed a couple of hours or so, very agreeably, he suddenly took up his hat and, leaning over the table and looking me full in the face, said in a low voice, "Well, mister, we've been a very pleasant together, and I'll speak my mind tonight. Do not let Weda send her little boy to yon our schoolmasters, while there's a house to hold in a Lunnon, or a gouther to lie asleep in. I wouldn't make old words among my neighbours, and I'll speak to ye quiet like. But I'm doomed if I can go to bed and not tell for Weda's sake, to keep that little boy from a sick scoundrels, while there's a house to hold in a Lunnon, or a gouther to lie asleep in." Repeating these words with great heartiness, and with a solemnity on his jolly face that made it look as large as before, he shook his hands and went away. I never saw him afterwards, but I sometimes imagine that I descry a faint reflection of him in John Browdie. In reference to these gentry, I may here quote a few words from the original preface to this book. It has afforded the author great amusement and satisfaction during the progress of this work, to learn from country friends and from a variety of ludicrous statements concerning himself in provincial newspapers, that more than one Yorkshire schoolmaster lays claim to being the original of Mr. Squeers. One worthy, he has reason to believe, has actually consulted authorities learned in the law as to his having good grounds on which to rest an action for libel. Another has meditated a journey to London for the express purpose of committing an assault and battery on his traducer. A third perfectly remembers being waited on last January 12th by two gentlemen, one of whom held him in conversation while the other took his likeness, whom it is meant. And although Mr. Squeers has but one eye, and he has two, and the published sketch does not resemble him, whoever he may be, in any other respect, still he and all his friends and neighbours know at once for whom it is meant, because the character is so like him, while the author cannot but feel the full force of the compliment thus conveyed to him. He ventures to suggest that these contentions may arise from the fact that Mr. Squeers is the representative of a class, and not of an individual, where imposture, ignorance, and brutal cupidity are the stock in trade of a small body of men, and one is described by these characteristics, all of his fellows will recognize something belonging to themselves, and each will have a misgiving that the portrait in his own. The author's object in calling public attention to the system would be very imperfectly fulfilled if he did not state now, in his own person, emphatically and earnestly, that Mr. Squeers and his school are faint and feeble pictures of an existing reality, purposefully subdued and kept down lest they should be deemed impossible. There is only one other point on which I would desire to offer a remark. If Nicholas be not always found to be blameless or agreeable, he is not always intended to appear so. He is a young man of an impetuous temper, and of little or no experience, and I saw no reason why such a hero should be lifted out of nature. Chapter 1. There once lived, in a sequestered part of the county of Devonshire, one Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, a worthy gentleman who, taking it into his head rather late in life that he must get married, and not being young enough or rich enough to aspire to the hand of a lady of fortune, had wedded an old flame out of mere attachment, who in her turn had taken him for the same reason. Thus two people who cannot afford to play cards for money sometimes sit down to a quiet game for love. Some ill-conditioned persons who sneer at the life matrimonial may perhaps suggest in this place that the good couple would be better likened to two principals in a sparring match, who, when fortune is low and bacca scarce, will chivalrously set to for the mere pleasure of the buffeting. And in one respect, indeed, this comparison would hold good. For as the adventurous pair of the Fives Court will afterwards send round a hat, and trust to the bounty of the lookers-on for the means of regaling themselves, so Mr. Godfrey Nickleby and his partner, the honeymoon being over, looked out wistfully into the world, relying in no inconsiderable degree upon chance for the improvement of their means. Mr. Nickleby's income at the beginning of his marriage fluctuated between £60 and £80 per annum. There are people enough in this world, heaven knows, and even in London, where Mr. Nickleby dwelt in those days, but few complaints prevail of the population being scanty. It is extraordinary how long a man may look among the crowd without discovering the face of a friend, but it is no less true Mr. Nickleby looked and looked, till his eyes became sore as his heart, but no friend appeared, and when, growing tired of the search, he turned his eyes homeward, he saw very little there to relieve his weary vision. A painter who has gazed too long upon some glaring colour refreshes his dazzled sight by looking upon a darker and more sombre tint. But everything that met Mr. Nickleby's gaze wore so black and gloomy a hue that he would have been beyond description refreshed by the very reverse of the contrast. And that embarrassed gentleman, impressed with the necessity of making some provision for his family, was seriously revolving in his mind a little commercial speculation of insuring his life next quarter day, and then, falling from the top of the monument by accident, there came, one morning, by the general post, a black bordered letter to inform him how his uncle, Mr. Ralph Nickleby, was dead, and had left him the bulk of this little property, amounting in all to £5,000 sterling. As the deceased had taken no further notice of his nephew in his lifetime than sending to his eldest boy a silver spoon in a morocco case, which, as he had not too much to eat with, seemed a kind of satire upon his having been born without that useful article of plate in his mouth. Mr. Godfrey Nickleby could, at first, scarcely believe the tidings thus conveyed on him. On examination, however, they turned out to be strictly correct. The amiable old gentleman, it seemed, had intended to leave the whole to the Royal Humane Society, and had indeed executed a will to that effect. But the institution having been unfortunate enough, a few months before, to save the life of a poor relation to whom he paid a weekly allowance of 3 shillings and 6pence, he had, in a fit of very natural exasperation, revoked the bequest in a codicil, and left it all to Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, with a special mention of his indignation, not only against the society for saving the poor relation's life, but against the poor relation also, for allowing himself to be saved. With a portion of this property Mr. Godfrey Nickleby purchased a small farm, near Dawlish in Devonshire, whither he retired with his wife and 2 children, to live upon the best interest he could get for the rest of his money, and the little produce he could raise from his land. The 2 prospered so well together that when he died some 15 years after this period, and some 5 after his wife, he was enabled to leave, to his eldest son, Ralph, £3,000 in cash, and to his youngest son, Nicholas, 1,000 and the farm, which was as small a landed estate as one would desire to see. These 2 brothers had been brought up together in a school at Exeter, and being accustomed to go home once a week, had often heard from their mother's lips long accounts of their father's sufferings in his days of poverty, and of their deceased uncle's importance in his days of affluence, which recitals produced a very different impression on the 2, for while the younger, who was of a timid and retiring disposition, gleaned from thence nothing but forewarnings to shun the great world and attach himself to the quiet routine of a country life, Ralph, the elder, deduced from the often repeated tale the 2 great morals that riches are the only true source of happiness and power, and that it is lawful and just to compass their acquisition by all means, short of felony. And, reasoned Ralph with himself, if no good came from my uncle's money when he was alive, a great deal of good came of it after he was dead, inasmuch as my father has got it now, and is saving it up for me, which is a highly virtuous purpose. And going back to the old gentleman, good did come of it to him too, for he had the pleasure of thinking of it all his life long, and of being envied and courted by all his family besides. And Ralph always wound up these mental soliloquies by arriving at the conclusion that there was nothing like money. Not confining himself to theory, or permitting his faculties to rust, even at that early age in mere abstract speculations, this promising lad commenced usurer on a limited scale at school, putting out at good interest a small capital of slate pencil and marbles, and gradually extending his operations until they aspired to the copper coinage of this realm, in which he speculated to considerable advantage. Nor did he trouble his borrowers with abstract calculations of figures or references to ready reckoners, his simple rule of interest being all comprised in the one golden sentence, 2p for every halfpenny, which greatly simplified the accounts, and which, as a familiar precept, more easily acquired and retained in the memory than any known rule of arithmetic, cannot be too strongly recommended to the notice of capitalists, both large and small, and more especially of money brokers and bilk discounters. Indeed, to do these gentlemen justice, many of them are to this day in the frequent habit of adopting it, with eminent success. In like manner, did young Ralph Nickleby avoid all those minute and intricate calculations of odd days, which nobody who has worked sums in simple interest can fail to have found most embarrassing, by establishing the one general rule that all sums of principal and interest should be paid on the pocket-money day, that is to say, on Saturday, and that whether a loan were contracted on the Monday or on the Friday, the amount of interest should be, in both cases, the same. Indeed, he argued, and with great show of reason, that it ought to be rather more for one day than for 5, inasmuch as the borrower might in the former case be very fairly presumed to be in great extremity, otherwise he would not borrow at all with such odds against him. This fact is interesting as illustrating the secret connection and sympathy which always exist between great minds, though Master Ralph Nickleby was not at the same time aware of it. The class of gentlemen before alluded to proceeded on just the same principle in all their transactions. From what we have said of this young gentleman, and the natural admiration the reader will immediately conceive of his character, it may perhaps be inferred that he is to be the hero of the work which we shall presently begin. To set this point at rest for once and forever, we hasten to undeceive them, and stride to its commencement. On the death of his father, Ralph Nickleby, who had been some time before placed in a mercantile house in London, applied himself passionately to his old pursuit of money-getting, in which he speedily became so buried and absorbed that he quite forgot his brother for many years, and if at any time a recollection of his old playfellow broke upon him through the haze in which he lived, for gold conjures up a mist about a man, more destructive of all his old senses and lulling to the feelings than the fumes of charcoal. It brought along with it a companion thought, that if they were intimate, he would want to borrow money of him. So Mr. Ralph Nickleby shrugged his shoulders, and said things were better as they were. As for Nicholas, he lived a single man on the patrimonial estate until he grew tired of living alone, and then he took to wife the daughter of a neighbouring gentleman with a dower of £1,000. This good lady bore him 2 children, a son and a daughter, and when the son was about 19, and the daughter 14, as near as we can guess, impartial records of young ladies' ages being, before the passing of the new Act, nowhere preserved in the registries of this country, Mr. Nickleby looked about him for the means of repairing his capital, now sadly reduced by this increase in his family, and the expenses of their education. "Speculate with it," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Speculate, my dear," said Mr. Nickleby, as though in doubt. "Why not?" asked Mrs. Nickleby. "Because, my dear, if we should lose it," rejoined Mr. Nickleby, who was a slow and time-taking speaker, "if we should lose it, we shall no longer be able to live, my dear." "Fiddle," said Mrs. Nickleby. "I am not altogether pure of that, my dear," said Mr. Nickleby. "There's Nicholas," pursued the lady, "quite a young man. It's time he was in the way of doing something for himself. And Kate, too, poor girl, without a penny in the world. Think of your brother. Would he be what he is if he hadn't speculated? "That's true," replied Mr. Nickleby. "Very good, my dear. Yes, I will speculate, my dear." Speculation is a round game. The players see little or nothing of their cards at first starting. Gains may be great, and so may losses. The run of luck went against Mr. Nickleby. A mania prevailed, a bubble burst. 4 stockbrokers took villa residences at Florence. 400 nobodies were ruined, and among them Mr. Nickleby. "The very house I live in," sighed the poor gentleman, "may be taken from me tomorrow. Not an article of my old furniture, but will be sold to strangers." The last reflection hurt him so much that he took at once to his bed, apparently resolved to keep that at all events. "Cheer up, sir," said the apothecary. "You mustn't let yourself be cast down, sir," said the nurse. "Such things happen every day," remarked the lawyer. "And it is very sinful to rebel against them," whispered the clergyman. "And what no man with a family ought to do," added the neighbours. Mr. Nickleby shook his head and, motioning them all out of the room, embraced his wife and children, and having pressed them by turns to his languidly beating heart, sunk exhausted on his pillow. They were concerned to find that his reason went astray after this, for he babbled for a long time about the generosity and goodness of his brother, and the merry old times when they were at school together. This fit of wandering past he solemnly commended them to one who had never deserted the widow or her fatherless children, and smiling gently on them, turned upon his face and observed that he thought he could fall asleep. Mr. Ralph Nickleby was not, strictly speaking, what you would call a merchant. Neither was he a banker, nor an attorney, nor a special pleader, nor a notary. He was certainly not a tradesman, and still less could he lay any claim to the title of a professional gentleman, for it would have been impossible to mention any recognized profession to which he belonged. Nevertheless, as he lived in a spacious house in Golden Square, which in addition to a brass plate upon the door, had another brass plate 2 sizes and a half smaller upon the left-hand doorpost, surrounding a brass model of an infant's fist, grasping a fragment of a skewer, and displaying the word office, it was clear that Mr. Ralph Nickleby did, or pretended to do, business of some kind, and the fact, if it required any further circumstantial evidence, was abundantly demonstrated by the diurnal attendance, between the hours of 9:30 and 5, of a sallow-faced man in rusty brown, who sat upon an uncommonly hard stool in a species of butler's pantry at the end of the passage, and always had a pen behind his ear when he answered the bell. Although a few members of the graver professions live about Golden Square, it is not exactly in anybody's way to or from anywhere. It is one of the squares that have been a quarter of the town that has gone down in the world, and taken to letting lodgings. Many of its first and second floors are let, furnished to single gentlemen, and it takes boarders besides. It is a great resort of foreigners, the dark-complexioned men who wear large rings, and heavy watch guards and bushy whiskers, and who congregate under the opera colonnade, and about the box office in the season, between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, when they give away the orders. All live in Golden Square, or within a street of it. 2 or 3 violins and a wind instrument from the opera band reside within its precincts. Its boarding houses are musical, and the notes of pianos and harps float in the evening time round the head of the mournful statue, the guardian genius of a little wilderness of shrubs in the centre of the square. On a summer's night, windows are thrown open, and groups of swarthy moustached men are seen by the passer-by, lounging at the casements and smoking fearfully. Sounds of gruff voices practising vocal music invade the evening silence, and the fumes of choice tobacco scent the air. There, snuff and cigars, and German pipes and flutes and violins and violoncellos divide the supremacy between them. It is the region of song and smoke. Street bands are on their mettle in Golden Square, and itinerant glee singers quaver involuntarily as they raise their voices within its boundaries. This would not seem a spot very well adapted to the transaction of business, but Mr. Ralph Nickleby had lived there, notwithstanding for many years, and uttered no complaint on that score. He knew nobody round about, and nobody knew him, although he enjoyed the reputation of being immensely rich. The tradesmen held that he was a sort of lawyer, and the other neighbours opined that there was a kind of general agent, both of which guesses were as correct and definite as guesses about other people's affairs usually are or need to be. Mr. Ralph Nickleby sat in his private office one morning, ready dressed to walk abroad. He wore a bottle green spencer over a blue coat, a white waistcoat, grey mixture pantaloons and Wellington boots drawn over them. The corner of a small plaited shirt frill struggled out, as if insisting to show itself from between his chin and the top button of his spencer, and the latter garment was not made low enough to conceal a long gold watch chain, composed of a series of plain rings, which had its beginning at the handle of a gold repeater in Mr. Nickleby's pocket, and its termination in two little keys, one belonging to the watch itself, and the other to some patent padlock. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. I also hope that you're feeling a little drowsy. If you're not quite tired enough yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Bore You to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.